Okay, welcome everyone. Clap once if you can hear my voice. Clap twice if you can hear my voice. Thank you very much. Welcome to another day of JavaScript. Um, as I said yesterday, we are going to continue in functions. Yesterday we kind of saw an introduction to what functions were. We're just going to expand that introduction and get the full picture on functions. So let's remind ourselves what we were doing yesterday. Let's see. Actually, before we go into that, somebody can raise their hand and share with us what the motivation behind functions is. Like, why would we want to use functions in our programs? What are some of those reasons? I mean, something repetitive is better to put it in a function than call that function. Anybody else wants to contribute? Sure. A little bit louder. Good point. It's a good way to modularize your code and kind of instead of having a one big program, you have a bunch of smaller pieces that when you put them together, they do the work that the entire program should do, right? So those are the two great reasons. One is when you're doing repetitive stuff, and when you want to break down your program into smaller pieces, right? And I feel like, what I will add to your definition is once we want to encapsulate code, right? So that we can call that program again with different input and get still the same result, or get the result that we want out of the function, right? So to encapsulate and reuse, that's actually the word that I wanted to use, to reuse code. That is one of the biggest motivations behind functions, so that we make our code reusable as much as possible. Okay, so we saw that yesterday we were thinking about this problem where we had two arrays and we wanted to console log them. And for doing that, we needed to create two different for loops, right? So in here, we don't want to repeat ourselves and write another for loop that does exactly the same. And that's the function that we are going to get to create today. Also, let's say, as a refresher, who can help me write a function that adds two numbers? So, kind of to remind ourselves as to the anatomy of a function is. Douglas?
I want to start off with the function.
The function keyword?
Right.
Okay, right. Somebody else, who's that?
Then you want to assign name.
Then you want the name, so let's call it maybe add two nums. Somebody else. Joanne? Then we use parentheses, and then we have, what do we have inside the parentheses? Okay, and we want to add two nums, so maybe we want num1 and num2. Great. What else? Vanille. And why do we put the curly braces? Right, that's correct, to associate whatever we put inside the curly brackets with the function, or in other words, to give this function a body, and everything that we want this function to do, we'll write inside the body of the function. Okay, this looks like a very healthy function to me. What's the other pieces that we're missing? Like, so far we declared the function, we call it add two nums. Is this function doing anything at the moment? Okay. How do you know that it's not doing anything? The body is empty, right? Okay, let's have this function do something. So what should I put in the body? Return. Why? Right, I will put num1 plus num2. Like that? I mean, like that? Okay, everyone agrees that this is how we could add two numbers. Lewis? I'll change. I'm sorry. Give me 1 second. So we have a special occasion. Somebody got a job and they're about to ring the gong. So we could mobilize ourselves to the gong.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, yeah. At the same time, like, they're the ones that as time goes on, we realize yeah, like asking always have my classmates always yeah, like I live like people words the same to develop and define the way that's also important to find one that can teach you on time. That's what we do. That's the one we do. Yeah, what's this house? I remember the first day, the first job, struggling by that people, yeah, taking five tickets advice that they don't.
Happy you.
I think we should, by that time, should be doing some exercises.
Okay, cool. I
The
think
lessons.
she asked you
Uh-huh.
if you're going to be. I
Yep.
just want to leave.
Cool.
Wasn't that great?
Yeah.
Right? You all can be that too. We'll be applauding for you. Cool. Let's wait for this to turn on. Cool. Okay, so we were trying to write a function that adds two numbers, num1 and num2. Do we then trust that this is going to work? Why? Sure.
Because you're like adding num1 plus num2.
Right. Like this. So you're saying that this is wrong. The plus equal, right? We should just do equal plus. Cool. And then why do I want the return? Deja? Right, and then no, not exactly. What happens if we forget to do the return? This function will return undefined. Let's see it first working, and then we break it, and let's see after that how it doesn't work. Okay, so I have my function. If I run my program, is it going to do anything? Let's try. Node functions. Let's see if I have any other code here. Okay. Right, it doesn't do anything. What did I forget? Console log? Somebody is saying console log, somebody else is saying let. Right, I have to call the function for the function to actually do something. So let's call the function. How do we call the function? We name it and then what? Parentheses. What do I put inside the parentheses? I mean, two arguments, that's correct. And where are those arguments going to be? In this case? Two numbers. Give me another number. 5, I heard. Okay. Let's see. Let's try to run our code. Still not doing anything, apparently. Right? So, how can I make it show something? Joanne? Could say something like let result equal that. Okay. And then console log result. Okay, so in this case, what is result going to be? 7. Okay, let's try it. Right, now we see the return value, which was stored in result. and it's equal to 7. So there is something that I wanted to emphasize here, which is, actually, wait, before we do that, let's see it again, but without the return. O'Neill says is going to return undefined, and indeed it returns undefined, right? If we forget the return value of any function, by default, JavaScript is going to return to you undefined. Now, the difference that I wanted to mention is console logging or printing is not the same as returning. So sometimes you will see something like this. Result, right? Now, this caller function, let's remove this one, for instance, or let's just comment it out. I'm going to comment the console log result. I'm going to run my function, or my program rather, and I still see 7. But what is my function returning? Right, it's not even returning just the console.log, it's running the console.log. What does console.log do? It just prints to the terminal. But if I see console.log result, what am I going to see? If I leave it, what is this console.log going to do? Yeah, Douglas?
Console log the result of the function.
Okay, and in this case, what is the result of the function add 2 nums?
Double plus defined by the argument next to the function.
Okay, let's try it. Oh, I forgot to say it. So we see 7 and undefined. 7 and undefined. So what is the return value of this function? Undefined, right? Because, well, I forgot to include the return keyword, right? And then this function does, we could say this function prints the sum of num1 plus num2, but it doesn't return the value, right? And in this case, if we forget that, then we'll see basically what we have on screen, which is we see console log 7, but when we look at the result, we didn't really capture the result, right, of the function, because again, the function is not really returning. So the difference that I wanted to note here is that console log is not the same as returning. Console log will print whatever you pass it to the terminal, but it's not going to return to you any specific value. Okay, now we saw how we can invoke function. Actually, any questions here? I think you all have the anatomy of a function pretty well established. Oh, I also wanted to draw your attention to, for instance, the functions. Actually, let's get this back. Let's do return num1 plus num2. Let's see what we have now. Screen only the 7. A function that we have been using, maybe without thinking or realizing that it's a function, is console.log function. Console.log is a function. Why do you think so? Or how can you tell? Sure. The parentheses, right? This is what gives it away. The fact that when we call our function add 2 nums, we use parentheses and we pass arguments inside those parentheses, right? The same thing we're doing in console log. And then where did we see before the dot notation in one of the past lessons? Jonathan? Objects, right? So we can access properties of an object when we do object.property or object let's say closet.summer, right? In this case, we're doing the same thing. It's just that the console object was written for us by the JavaScript engineers who built it, and then that object has a property called log. But when a property is a function, we call it slightly different, which is a method or just a function. In this case, somewhere in JavaScript there is an object, the ones that you have seen, called console, and it has a log property that is going to be a function that we can call. So this touches back as to what I said in the objects lesson, which is almost everything in JavaScript is an object. Cool. Any additional questions? Okay, so we wrote a function that adds two numbers. Now this is for a little bit of a backstory. JavaScript, the latest version of JavaScript is called ES6, and that is because the official name of JavaScript is something called ECMAScript. So let me show you that. ES6. So, or also known as JavaScript ES6. And then here, for instance, we can see ECMAScript 6. ECMAScript 6 is also known as ES6 or ECMAScript 2015. So this is a version of JavaScript that was released in 2015, and this is the most up-to-date version that we have. Right, and you can tell it's what other stuff is like the centuries. I always got confused when we say this is the 21st century, right? But we're still in the 2000s. We're not in the 2100, right? This is similar in JavaScript where we are. This is the version of 2015. What we say is ECMAScript 6. Yep.
When Carla was here, had a discussion about something. Pastry man had said something about is now because of.
Say that again.
When Carla was here, he asked you something. You said no, actually. What?
Oh, yeah, that was. He was saying that JavaScript is functional programming or function-oriented programming language. Yeah, but in reality, JavaScript is an object-oriented programming language. It could be used as a functional programming language too. So here we can see that. So the true name of JavaScript is ECMAScript 6. That's the technical name, and the latest version is ES6 by the E in the ECMA and S in script. We can see that in that new version, we got these new features. We got let, const, something arrow functions that we're just about to see. We got classes that we will see at some point as well, and a bunch of other features. Yeah, bro.
Is that why var was replaced with ES6?
That's correct. In the previous version, which was ES5, we had var, and then EX6 introduced let and const. And we started using let and const instead of just var. Before, for instance, we didn't have a keyword to say this variable is never going to change. Everything was just var, and it could change. But now the ECMA standards body decided we should have a way in which variables cannot be changed. Let's introduce that in the next version of JavaScript. So again, this is the ES6. We're mostly here. We're gonna be writing ES6, the latest version. You could find in the wild a lot. There's also legacy code that is written in ES5. And something important to notice here is that EX6 is not incompatible with ES5. It is not incompatible. So everything you could even do a mix between EX5 and EX6 because they're both the technical term will be ES6 is backwards compatible, right? Yeah.
So will you accept bar in our answers?
Yes, but I'll prefer you use let all times. Any questions? So, okay, so what I wanted to get to this is, also I wanted to show you ECMAScript in here. ECMA is the standard body that says how JavaScript should work. These guys write the rules by which JavaScript have to abide for. And if we go to the website, the ECMA Standard International, we have, somewhere in here we have the specification of JavaScript where all the technical details and nuances of JavaScript are written. You could even write your own version of JavaScript if you follow the standard that these people set out to do. And you could play anything, but yeah, just so that you know that there's these people who created the standard that says how JavaScript should work, and you could create your own if you wanted to. Cool. So that was all to say that in this here, so let, we saw that let is something that came in the new version, so that's ES6. And this function add to nums is the ES5 version, the previous version, or the previous way in which we did write functions. Now ES6 has another way, right? The new way is, we could say something like const, then the name of the function. Let's do add to nums ES6 to differentiate it. Just like if we were going to declare any regular variable, right? You do one of the two keywords, const or let. You do equal, and because you want this to be a function, instead of saying that equal to true, because this will not be a function, right? Or instead of saying add to nums ES6 equal to 100, that will not be a function. What we do is we use parentheses here, and we just pass we use the parameters here. And everything else, and important here is that we have this new symbol, if you will, which is known as a fat arrow, which is the equal sign and the greater than sign. And then we just use regular curly brackets. So, and everything inside here will be just regular. Any questions? Yeah, Peter? Right, we have to use this arrow. If we skip it, you can tell that my editor is complaining here, saying expected the arrow. And if I try to run this code, JavaScript should also complain. Right, it says on functions.js line 40, right here, it found an unexpected token. It was expecting the fat arrow, but instead it just saw a square curly bracket. So yeah, we must always forget add this. So if I change this to add nums ES6, I should be able to see the same result. Everything should work just as usual. Any other questions? Yeah, Joy. That is a good question. Mostly we're going to be doing ES6. There is one instance where you would like to do the regular, the all way. It is not very common. I haven't used it a lot since I learned ES6. But something that ES5 will allow you to do is, which actually is a good segue to the next topic that we're going to talk about, which is function hosting. So let's first see the definition of that word. So function hosting, it says, for hoist, we have raise something by means of ropes, or I don't know how to pronounce that word, pulleys? To raise something. So let's see what that means in JavaScript. I think we saw some of this yesterday. With our ES6 function. Let's try to call the function before we have declared it. We have our ES6 function, and I'm going to try to call it before it has been declared. What do we think is going to happen? It's not going to work. Michael? You think it's still going to run? Let's see. Let's do a thumbs up. People who think it's not going to run, it's going to break. Okay, thumbs middle, the people who say it's going to work. Cool, that's it. Node function. JavaScript is complaining. Reference error, add to nums ES6 is not defined. Why is it that? Douglas?
Because this concept exists after the concept has been. Yeah.
That's correct. We are trying to call a function called add to nums, but this function doesn't exist before. It only exists after. So after this point, we can call a function not before, right? But if we had written that function, so Joey, this is one of the reasons that you may want to use it. Let's use the ES5. Let's change this num to ES5 to tell them apart. I define the function after, but I'm trying to call it before. Add to nums ES5. So here, thumbs up if you think it's going to work. Okay, thumbs middle if you think it's going to break the way that it broke before. Okay, now there's some reluctancy as to what is going to happen. Let's try it again. Now it works. And this is all to say that when we write a function with the ES5 syntax, with the function keyword, note that we don't have the function keyword in the ES5 version, ES6 version, right? When you write a function with the ES5 syntax, what happens is that function gets hoisted to the top of the program. There is when we type node function, there are two steps that is happening. One is checking for mistakes and wherever you're trying to call stuff that is not defined yet. And after that kind of task passes, then we run the program, right? So you can think of it as another program that kind of goes through our code, checking that everything works and that everything goes well. And then after that, the actual execution happens. In this case, when the first step, which is a program that's going through our code, reviewing everything, sees a function definition like this, it takes it out of the line. We could imagine it takes it out from line 38 and it puts it all the way up top. We could kind of visualize it in that way. So that is to say that, yeah, in here, when we use ES5, functions will get hoisted. And again, this is something that this will give you the advantage of calling something. Like I could call my function here, even though my function in ES6, EX5 is defined later on in the program, it will still work. but it's something that I personally haven't used a lot. That feature as to being able to declare the function anywhere and then call it anywhere else. Most of the time, I liked my code to still abide by the rule, like top to bottom, right? And then I will define the function before I use it. Right? Any other questions? Sure. Good question. Is good practice to use const for the ES6 function rather than let? Well, the answer will be in when do we use let and when do we use const? Brianni, when do you use let? Right, okay, that's good. So let is kind of the opposite of const, right? It will be when you want to change the value. So const is when the value is never going to change. We want let when we want the value to change over time. Like for instance, when we're looping over an array and we have let we want I to change from 0 to 1 up until the array length. In this case, I haven't seen a time where I want my function to ever change. So I'll use const because I know that I don't want to say, later on in my program, I don't want to say something like add two nums equal to still the same thing. Let's say instead of that, I now wanted to multiply them. What I'm saying is I never want to do something like this. So const is because the function is never going to change, or the value that this variable is holding is a function, and that value we never want it to change. Joy? In here, I'll be trying to change the function, right? But one is JavaScript is not going to let me because I declare with const. Right? Now it says assignment to constant variable. So if I define it with let, it's going to let me do that. But what I'm trying to say is we never want to do that. The old way of declaring a function. If you try to change this, you mean something like declaring it again? Let's see. So again, I don't want to do this. So let's kind of change it by doing 1, 2, and then return num1. That's not. I think JavaScript in this case is going to let me do that. So let's try to console log result 1 equal add two nums 2 result 2 same one. Now let's console log result 1 followed by result 2. Oh, I guess that's a difficult example. Because multiplying 2 by 1 is 2. Oh, no, actually, that was a good example. But we still get 6 in both. So it seems like we just overwrote what add num, the original add num was. And note here, yeah? Say that? It will act like let, yeah. Or rather, in this case, they're actually acting like just var. Because let will complain if it sees two variables with the same name, that I'm defining two variables with the same let. Let's say let A, and then after that I said let A again. JavaScript is going to complain saying re-declaring a variable that was already declared. But if I do node let A equal 1, if I try to do let A equal 2, JavaScript complains saying identifier A has already been declared. In this case, these two functions, they don't complain, saying there's already a function call at nums5. So luckily we don't have to, we are going to be using more of ES6 syntax than ES5. Yeah, Cameron? So the question is, let's go back to that. The purpose of the fat arrow is not to hoist it, not to take it out to the top. I wouldn't say that directly. We could see the fat arrow function as somewhat of a special, with a special meaning that is similar to the function keyword. It's actually the one that tells it that it's a function. So rather than the hoisting part, the fat arrow tells JavaScript that this is a function. That what I'm highlighting here, the parenthesis up until the closing, is a function. So we could imagine, we could kind of, for our mental model, we could think as saying this arrow, or yeah, typing this arrow function, arrow will be the same as to kind of saying the function keyword or using the function keyword. This is a special, I wouldn't say a special keyword, a special symbol, but I think I'll need to know the exact definition for that. But yeah, this is a special combination of characters, the equal and the greater than. Okay, so we saw the hoisting, and that's something, that is a question that you might get. It's more of a trivia question where you could get what's hoisting in JavaScript. And we do have to be aware of, when we're writing code, we want that code to be as compatible as possible with the previous versions, right? As I said, every ES6 is backwards compatible with ES5. So by writing, if you have, for instance, Internet Explorer, which is an older browser, that browser only understands ES5, right? So what we want is, if we want to create a web application that targets that browser, we will have to write our application in ES5. But luckily, JavaScript is very flexible, and what we can do is write the application in ES6, and then there are translators that you could just give your application. And these are, by translator, I mean just other programs that you pass in your code, and that will translate your code from ES6 to ES5. Those are called transpilers. But yeah, that's kind of a rather advanced topic. But yeah, that's in case you're concerned about compatibility in the web. Okay, so we saw that we had already talked about, we want functions to do one thing and one thing only. Very rarely you want a function to do more than one thing. So in this case, we want this function to add two numbers, nothing else. I hope that's clear. Now, functions can have something we call side effects. And a side effect is when a function modifies the outside world, or the scope, the global scope that we call it. So one example of a function that has a side effect is console.log. Even though we don't know how console.log is written, we can tell it has a side effect because we see that interacts with the outside world by printing something to the console, right? The terminal is somehow in the outside of my program, right? So console.log console.log is a function that doesn't return any value, right? We can see, let's actually explore that first. Let me remove this. Just result. Departing from the fact that we now know that console.log is a function, we could see if console.log returns anything. We could do that by, let's declare a variable called return of console.log. Console.log. And then maybe let's console.log the return of console.log. So we know that functions, most of the time we want functions to return a value to us, right? In the case of adding two numbers, we want to return the result of those two numbers. So I'm just curious to see if console.log, which is a function, has any return value. Let's see. So I'm calling console.log the function here, and I'm storing the result of that into the return of console.log. Let's see. So have result. Identify result has already been declared. Functions line 46. Oh, this one, yeah. Okay, so I'm seeing 5 and undefined. Let's see. What's the 5? Where is the 5 coming from? Right, adding two numbers, then we save that 5 into result. And then here we just console.log result. And then because this is a function, I want to see if it returns something that is going to be saved to return of console.log. And then I try to console.log the return of console.log, and we see undefined. So this is to say console.log doesn't return any value, but it does have the side effect of interacting with the outside world. And in this case, that outside world is our console or terminal, and it prints this to the screen. So another example of a side effect that is, if you have here the definition that a side effect is when a function modifies the outside world, this example should also make sense. So let me comment these two. Let's do let number equal 1. And then I'm going to use my ES6 syntax, const side effect. Let's just call this side effects. It's equal to a function denoted here by the parentheses, the fat arrow, curly brackets. So how many parameters is my function expecting here? How many parameters is my function expecting? Peter? None, right? 0, because I don't have anything in here in my parentheses. Okay, so this is a function called side effect. Now I want my function to somehow interact or modify the outside world, and by that we are going to do, let's add one to num. Let's put this back. Salt. I'm going to take this to the top because it belongs to the previous section. Okay, so we have a function, we have a variable outside the function called num1. Num is equal to 1. Then we have a function called side effect that is going to try to add 1 to num. And so let's call the function side effect. We call it by utilizing the parentheses after the name. And now I'm going to console log num1. No, just num. So let's run this. Let's see. Now we have 2. We have in the terminal, we see that the number 2 was console logged. So who could explain to me what went on in here? Pearl? What went on in here? O'Neill?
I think because num1 is global and the function has num inside, so it called it, use it and add it on.
Right, we're gonna get to that, which is, we have something called the global scope. That is everything that is not inside a block of code, delimited by curly brackets. And these functions have access to, so in other words, we could say this function has access to the outside world. You can see what is outside of it. And what it did is, because you can see the outside world, which is everything that's outside of the curly brackets, is able to add 1 to the num variable. And this is called a side effect because what's the definition of a side effect? Right, as Shara said, it changes the outside. This function was able to sort of reach outside of itself and add 1 to that number that was outside. And this is something that we try to avoid, or we don't truly want our functions to have a lot of side effects because it could give us weird results. If we had, let's see if we can have an example of that. But let's say, what happens if we have another num here, num1. Let's do this one equal to 2. No, let's just call it num. So we have one num that is inside, the other num is outside. Yes, Pearl? What's the purpose of having something local or global? That's a good question. The goal will be, let's say we don't want this value to ever be reached from the outside. So this is also to the idea of function, which is an encapsulated piece of code, right? So we could one way would be to protect a value, for instance. So I want to protect this let num local variable from the outside, and then in here a program will not be able to reach inside the function. This is something that I hope to explain with a diagram, which is functions have access to the outside world, but the opposite is not true. The outside world doesn't have access to what is inside the function.
Why?
That's a good question. I think it's just because that was the way that JavaScript,
Just the rule.
right? The way that JavaScript was made. And if you think about it, it makes sense to encapsulate pieces of code and have them be independent, right? So why would we have everything in the global?
Okay.
Uh-huh.
I understand why something is local. I just don't. Because what you're saying is that it comes from the outside world. And
Uh-huh.
sort of, I get affected.
Right. I guess so. We would want something to be global if we want that to be available to other pieces of our code. If we think about that, we can find out that console is global. Console is nowhere in our program. Console is global. Is available to any piece of code that we want to write. So we'll want something to be global when we want it to be universally available throughout our program.
When would this be used? Like, for what? What situation?
Let's see. I'm having trouble coming up with an example. Maybe JR could help me here. Like, when would we want to have something global? Or an example of that?
Let's say that you are trying to get summable, and then you have a function that. But in the end, you want the summable number function rather than having like each function having sum and then that's a lot of work, right? So like usually the global variable, like Adil said, is something that you want other functions to use it as well. This case like a sum. So that's like a one example there.
Right. Another example will be, for instance, yeah, Mike.
I have an example. Because you can call like in a function you can call another function. That's the reason why
Within a function, you can call another function. Yes, the example I was going to say is, let's say I come out of this program and I realize that I use certain programs that I wrote. I use a lot because they help me deal with arrays, for instance, or they help me deal with objects. And those functions that I wrote are not part of JavaScript. They're made by myself, and I found them useful. Maybe other developers don't find it useful. But they really help me, right? So something that I could do is I could put those functions in one object, right? And then make that object global so that anywhere in my code I could just use the functions that I wrote and not have to worry about, oh, did I declare them? I have to have them declared before I can use them. If I put them in the global scope, they'll be available throughout my program. That is, yeah, imagine I wrote my own version of console log that does something else that is very useful for me. I will want that to be available throughout my program. Yes.
So you can essentially put it anywhere.
If it's in the global, not put it anywhere, but if it's in the you will put it in the global scope, and that makes it available to call it anywhere. Okay, so we have this function side effect. We saw that it is reaching out of itself, changing an outside or a global scope. Now that we are using that language, we're changing a variable that is in the global scope. And I was trying to come up with an example where we will get weird behaviors here. I think. Let me see what I have here in my notes. yeah, I don't have a concrete example where we have where we wouldn't want or a strong argument why we wouldn't want to have side effects in our programs. I guess one argument I can make is also the idea of we want this code to be independent, for instance. So if I take this function and I put it in another file in another program, now it's no longer independent because it was reaching out of itself to use num1. So again, the idea of having this encapsulated piece of code that is independent, because if I take it out, then this function will not work as expected because it depends on the outside world to do its job. We oftentimes want it to be
So it's not independent.
Right. If it's reaching out of itself, it won't be independent because, well, what happens if that thing that is reaching for out is not there, right?
Yeah, because it's sort of connected to
It's connected to the global scope in the fact that it's trying to reach outside of itself, right? So we want something more encapsulated, like add to nums, which is not reaching outside, right? It's not trying to access anything outside of it. It's expecting you, the developer, to give it two arguments, and if you give them, fine. If you skip them, also fine. But in this way, it's like the function is not doing anything on its own. You, as the developer, have to give them the stuff that you want to give it. Does that make sense? In this case, I could take this function to a different outside world, and it will still work because it's not reaching, it's not dependent on anything outside of it. Okay, so let's do an exercise which is write a function in ES5 and ES6 syntax that is going to be called isEven. So this function is going to be called isEven. isEven, and this function is going to take a number and return whether it's even or not. So you're to write two functions, one in ES5 and one in EX6. And both functions will do the same thing, which is just determine if a number is even or odd. Let's take 5 minutes for that. Uh-huh.
Yeah, so this one, it is indeed.
And this can't go.
That's correct.
So do you see what I'm saying?
Okay, that is it. It is, the thing is that the country, but
But each
this,
independently is kind of, and it can do this and that.
right, I see. So the thing is, this one will be about,
Oh, nothing else.
yeah,
Okay.
but it's not funny.
Right. Yeah.
So in that case, I mean, you can, I don't think the analogy is Walmart is going to be so you can the,
Why don't you like it? Let's see if I can help you.
I think it's just the language.
Well, they won't need each other. We're going to make them dependent.
Yes.
They're not easy to
in a
handle.
way, this runs. This runs. It's just that
What happens?
let's say the problem what happens is a variable is created and it says it doesn't
Right. So what do you do? Leaves it?
yeah, I only say is it
So what happens here? Nothing happens at all.
it doesn't only
Everybody.
complaint breaks.
So the big, the this small thing that it saves 79.
And there's because
Well, save 79. That's
it's more about a function being declared or stored in the function. And the function being called. If you want the function to do the job, you need to call it. Yeah.
Okay. How did those functions come about? Do we need more time? Okay, let's do 2 minutes. Okay, let's look at some of those functions. Show them on 6.2 code. So let's see Brianna's. She has, let's look at the ES5. The function keyword, even or odd, it receives, is expecting the number, and then it says if number modulo 2 is equal to 0, then return num is even. Otherwise, return num is odd. Okay? Oh, that makes sense. Let's see the ES6 version. Even or odd 2, expecting the number, fat arrow. The same check, if the number is modulo 2 is equal to 0, then that means it's an even number. Otherwise, it's an odd number. Oh, that's... Anyway, any other comments from folks? Yeah, Cameron?
I'm curious, Adam was asking too much
Wait, what is Adam saying?
for the ES
Short arrow function?
shorthand.
Is it complaining? Like, is the code not running?
It's like,
Okay, maybe yeah, I can take a look at that. I think that must be something with your linter or warning. If JavaScript is not breaking, you should be okay. And we can look at the message. Okay, I wanted to ask here, what is the return value of this function? What is it going to return? What is the return value? I mean, right, it's going to be a string. Why? Somebody else. William?
Because you're adding the turn the num into.
Right, because in the return, we're doing string concatenation. We're just adding the number joined with the word is even. And then it's going to be ultimately a string. Let's see if this runs. Node function. The ES6 version, it says 9 is odd. The ES5 says 9 is odd. The ES6 version, it says 4 is even. That's correct. Thank you, Brianna. Did somebody else have a different return type? I mean, let's look at the means. Okay. Let's see. I really like Brianna's console log separated by this. I think this is really nice. So let's see. Actually, I like that so much that I'm going to include it in this one. Let's see. Let's see. I mean, is doing the same check. If it's modulo 2 equal to 0, then console logs num is even, and then it returns true if that's the case. So let's see what we have here. We see. Wait, where is that 2 coming from? Something else? Oh yeah, here. Now we see 4 is even and 5 is odd. So we still get the same result, right? But in this case, the difference is that the return type is what is the What's the return type here? A Boolean, right? True or false. We could say that a means function has a side effect. What's the side effect? The console log. So this function is doing two things. It's doing checking if the number is odd or even, and it's going to return true or false based on that. So that's the first thing, returning true or false. And the second thing that it's doing is console logging the number. This is good. This will be good for debugging purposes. In general, we want to avoid having, again, the single responsibility principle of functions. Have one function do only one thing. But again, this is perfectly fine for like debugging. In code, we will rarely have a console log before the return, only again for debugging. So, cool. And again, because, well, the console log interacts with the outside world, that will be the side effect. Cool. Anybody else got another different return type that is not a Boolean? And I guess here I wanted to mention that both are fine, both return types are fine. Whether console logging a string or returning rather a string, the number is even or odd. I find that this will be, this returning a Boolean in this case will make the function more reusable, because I could just check if the function gives me true or false. Right, in the example that Brianna gave us, which is the function returns, I should have kept that. Let's see if I can go back. Here. Let's paste them in here.
Low battery, please charge.
No, my speaker is complaining. How many bad? I have 10%. So here, this is Brianna's. Brianna is returning a string, right? If I wanted to do like an if I want to use this in an if statement for checking if a number is even or odd, I'll find a means easier to use because of the fact that he's, oh, wait, did I paste the means here? No, here. This is not either. Because I can say something with a means version, I can say something like if is even or, which is, this is going to return true or false, then I can do the console log for is even. Let's say, imagine we didn't have this here, this console log, the side effects that we didn't have. Right? I could do this with a means because a means function returns true or false. I couldn't do this with Brianna's because Brianna's returns a string saying the number is true or false. It doesn't return, the number is even or odd. It doesn't return to me a Boolean. So in this case, a better approach will be to return a Boolean, true or false. Does that make sense? So it makes sense for some of you. Any questions? Sure. Can we a little bit louder? That's a good question. Can you pass arrays as parameters here? Yes, you can pass literally anything. Yeah, any value type related to JavaScript you can pass. Yeah. What do you mean by that? Give me an example.
What we mean in that case, separate rate.
Right. So Michael's example is this function is expecting a number. What happens if you pass in an array, which is not a number? Then array modulo 2 equals 0 is not going to make sense, right? Because again, num will not be a number, will be an array. So the question that Michael asked was, is it good to always write, to check first, make sure that it's a number? Not in JavaScript. You could implement the checks that I think I saw you implementing some checks to verify if something is actually a number. You could implement a check here with type of. If you could check if type of num is equal to number. In JavaScript, the fact that is very flexible. It will still try to run with an array if you pass an array. But if your program requires you to make sure, then you should write that check to make sure that you pass in a number. Because I guess we can try it here. Like what happens if we do? Right, that's something you could Google how to tell an array apart from an object. There is a way that, but you'll have to write it. But in this case, let's say it's even and we're passing an array with the number 5. Let's console log. So since this is even ES6, it's going to return true or false. But we're passing an array. This is going to say array modulo 2 equal triple equals 0. Let's try to do that in Node here. Array 5 modulo 2 false. And it is false just because, well, what is array?
Low battery, please charge.
Oh, I think I'm gonna have to take this off. Sorry. What is array modulo 5? Array with the number 5 modulo 2. 1. That's just weird, right? It doesn't. Is it the same as saying this? In this case, it is. Let's say. Oh, maybe we just discovered that if we have. Oh, we just discovered kind of a dark corner of JavaScript, which is if the array has only one thing, like that, modulo will still work as expected. But if we have more than one thing, now it says that's not a number. So we inadvertently discovered one of those. You could say that's an Easter egg in JavaScript, so to say. This must be documented somewhere in the ECMA standard. It's just that it's not something that we will be using a lot. Yeah, Bueno. Yeah, right. We could do if you were given the task to determine if all of the numbers in this array is even, then you will need to look and check for each number. Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to that one. This is even. It's a good example. Now I want to go back to outside the. But the outer scope and inner scope is, or local scope. So we could think of local scope and outer scope, or global scope. It's just by looking at. So all our programs have something called the global scope, which is anything that is neither inside
curly brackets, or the body of a function, or the body of a loop. Everything that's just outside, like in here result 2, we say this is in the global scope. That is, any other pieces of code that we write past this point will have access to whatever is in the outer scope. But we also have inner or local scope. So for demonstrating that, let me remove this. And let's get back to maybe this example. We saw the side effect. We have this variable that exists in the global scope, and therefore side effect inside of it is able to access it and modify it, right? We were able to increment num by 1 in this case. Let's see that one more time. Right, so now num is 2. Now let's try to do this. Let's try to move num inside. Now num is no longer in the global scope. It is set to be in the local scope of this function. Now let's leave the rest as it is. Console log, trying to console log num. Now we have a reference error that says num is not defined. This is what I said earlier, where a local scope can have access to the global scope, but not the other way around. The global scope or anything that's outside cannot take a look at what's inside a given local scope. So even if we use var here, num is not defined. But so we can see that this console log here is trying to look for a variable called num in the global scope, but it cannot find it. So what this allows us to do is something like and thanks to the introduction of the let keyword, we can have something like another num outside. Let's do this one equal to 100. And now let's run our program. We see 100 here, right? So now we have 2 variables num. It's just that they live in different scopes. One is in the global scope, this one with the value 100, and another one with the value 1 inside the function. So let's do something like, let's console log here, num here. What do we think we are going to see in the terminal popping up? Peter? A little bit louder? 2? Oh, 2 what? Or just the number 2? That's it. Now we see 2, 1, and 100. So let, we can say here that the variable num is scope to the function, or is in the local scope of the function, or those are interchangeable language that we can use to describe this. And we have one outside and one inside. So some of you might have read that let is set to be block scoped. And what that means is, if we have, let's say this same example, but in a different context where we have something inside and something outside. We could have something called, let's have num. Let me cancel all this or comment this. Let's take this out. Yep. Right. That's a good example of scope. For instance, here we have these two for loops. What Shara is saying is this I is effectively separate from this one. Right, exactly. We use var, we will have a weird behavior here. But yes, this I only exists within the body of this for loop. And it's the same is said of the first I. But I want to demonstrate that again here with an if statement. So if we have an if statement that says, let's just do if true, then if for whatever reason I wanted this condition to be true, and I want to have another variable here called let num, let's set it to 0. Let's console log here num, and let's console log it outside. So we have this curly brackets created another scope. So in this case, what is inside the curly brackets has access to what's outside. And the opposite is not possible, where the outside has access to what's inside. Let's see that. What do we think we are going to see in the screen here? Shayna? Oh, okay. Sure. Zero and 100, let's see. 0 and 100. That's correct. Right, and then we have here again the same, where this variable exists in here. It doesn't exist outside. The outside variable is num equal 100. Before, when we had var, what do we think we're going to see? Var 0 and 100. 0 and 0. So again, this is like one of those kind of nuggets that we, as web developers, should differentiate, which is when we have this is what let being block scoped means. That in this case, when we declare this with let, this variable exists only in here. And when we do var num, is almost the same as if we declare it outside, because var is only is not block scoped, right? Because var is not block scoped. A little bit louder. Good question. Yes, it gets hoisted if we do console.log num here. let's console log this. Let's ignore this. Do functions. We have undefined. This console logging. We're trying to console log a variable that has not been declared yet. In this case, JavaScript doesn't break. But if we do let, now we have an identifier num has already been declared. Oh, that's because of no. It's already. Oh, that's because of this one. So now JavaScript's complaining saying num is not defined. So yes, that's another good point to take into account. Var gets hoisted to the top, just like regular functions. Any questions about this, Cameron? Yes, as long as it's global, you can access anywhere. I wanted to show this diagram, which I think I. Let's see if I can find it again. It's one that really captures this idea. Oh, I forgot to say another word that people use for scope is context. So you can say the global context and the local context. Those two are interchangeable. Say that again. This will be this function here is in the inner context, but this one is not a very good example actually. This is the one that I wanted to show. This we can see how the global scope, we have a variable called global variable. Global scope has access to only the global variable. Then there is another inner scope. In this case, we will have something like, imagine we have 3 functions, and each one is inside the other. Imagine this will be, actually we'll have 2 functions. One, the outer function, and then an inner function. And then the outside is just the global scope where everything else is. And then here we can see that our function has a variable called outer function variable, and then it says the outer function has access to the outer function variable and the global variable, right? It has access to what is in here, but also what is outside of it in the global scope. And if we had some other function inside of that, that inner function will have access to the inner function variable as well as the variable of the outer function, and ultimately the global access to the global variable that is in the global scope. Any questions about this? Yeah.
First, could you put that diagram for us?
Sure.
But the main question I have is it a good habit or proper form, as it were, to put your functions at the top of your code, wherever they show up in your code or at the bottom?
So the question is that a good practice to have, or what would be a better practice? Have all the functions at the top, somewhere randomly scattered, and all at the bottom? I would say good practice is to define your functions before you use them. I do find myself a lot of the time having them all at the top. I wouldn't say it's good or bad practice. And then in the later part, I actually use them and call them. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The counter argument, I guess, will be, or not counter argument, but if you have your functions scattered, let's say you're declaring them with ES5, which is the syntax that lets you declare them anywhere and then call them anywhere. For other developers looking at your code, it will be really tough to like follow along, where they see that you call a function at the top, you use them at the top, but then the function is defined at the bottom. So your code will be a little bit harder to read. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Okay, so we can only get this concept through practice. So I wanted to give you about the next hour to go to the previous labs that we have done. And what you're going to do is wrap the code blocks that you have been written in functions. So that, for instance, let's see the strings lab. Is this no? Or the loops or arrays lab. Some of you wrote it just a piece of code that takes in the array that you define in the global scope, and then immediately you just have a for loop that logs them all, or that does for instance, the FSW problem. So what I want now for you to do is to revisit those assignments and wrap every one of the answers for the questions in functions. And then you are going to say, let's do one example here. Right, for instance, here you wrote a piece of code for this exercise. Or let's see what else. Like, for instance, this one, log the last element of an array. So you have something like this. You have the array. And you have something like console.log array dot at index length -1, right? You have something like this. Now do node. I see the last element logged in or logged. Now what you want to do is create a function to wrap this expression so that I could pass in any array to the function and it will still console log the last element. So I'm going to do this one as an example. So I want to be able to console log the last element of any array, not only array of my array here. So for doing that, we realize that functions are the pieces of code that allow us to reuse code, right? So I'm going to declare a function. I'm going to use CS6 syntax, const, maybe log last. I'm going to also pick a name that makes sense in the sense of, I wouldn't call this sum or add two numbers, right? Because that's not what this function is going to do. So pick a name that conveys the idea of your code. In this case, I'm going to call it log last. I want to pass to my function an array. I'm going to remove this part. I want to pass in an array. I do my fat arrow. And I want to, in this case, Actually, instead of console log, I'm gonna call it return, because we saw that a console log will convey a side effect. And what if we, instead of just displaying it to the screen, I wanted to save it for some other reason, like let's say in the array you have your transaction history from your bank account, and you only want the last transaction, right? So let's do, I want to return last, and I'm just going to do return array at index array.length -1. Now I can have, I could say let A be one array. I'm going to have another one because I want to try it with a few examples. B is going to be, let's do it at the back. Let's do 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's try with maybe strings. A, B, C. And now, because I encapsulated the idea of returning the last element of my array, I could just reuse that piece of code instead of having to write 3 separate console logs, or console logs for displaying the last element of my array. And instead I'm going to do, let's create a variable maybe. Or in this case, let's do let A last. It's going to be equal to return last from, and I'm going to pass in A. I'm going to do the same for B. I'm going to do the same for C. And lastly, I just want to check that my program works, so I'm just going to console log A last. B and C. Let's try to run this. Oh, identifier A has already been declared. That means that somewhere else I have a variable called A. So is it clear what we want to do? We want to go over the answers that you turn in for your assignments and generalize that code by wrapping it in a function so that you can pass in any of the, you can pass in the value or the array or the object that that piece of code is using, instead of just having it in the global scope, being wrapped in a function so that you can call that function multiple times to, for instance, test your code with different inputs, with different arguments, without having to rewrite it if you want to do that. So actually, let's do that. Let's do this only for the for loop, not the for loop, the arrays assignment, because I think doing it for more than that will take us more time. So look at the arrays assignment. And go through all of this and then wrap them in a function so that you can reuse that piece of code that you originally wrote. I am going to be just floating around for anyone who have any questions or need any help. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
No, she was looking at me, but she was looking at me. Oh, looking at you? Yeah. Oh, I know. That was weird. You seem awesome. You got 5 days. My daddy was She asked me for.
Yes. Oh, yeah.